The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
And now we are at the interview part of the show. Today we have a writer that has writes a lot of true stories, and the one that caught my eye was, of course, Fire in the Big House, and it's America's deadliest prison disaster. And he's got something else he's working on, so we're going to talk about those. Thank you for taking the time, Mitchel Roth.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Mitchel, let's start with what led you into writing these kinds of stories.
Well, sometimes, since I'm one of the few historians that's in a criminology department in the country, I basically look for stories that have a criminological bent and that have never been told before, and try and write books and kind of discover, why it hasn't been written about. And my last book, of course, Fire in the Big House, was such a book. I mean, it was the worst prison disaster in American history. 320 inmates died in a fire, and yet we know about, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and all these other ones with substantially less victims. So, I'd always wondered, well, why didn't they write something about this? Why didn't anybody write a book? So, I think part of it was they were prisoners, considered kind of non-entities, and I was wondering why Columbus, where it took place, Columbus, Ohio, why they don't even have any type of memorial or anything like that. You walk by the shirtwaist factory, and there's a memorial there. So anyway, I looked deeper into it, and I found a lot of parallels with the prison overcrowding and America's love affair with the prison in the modern era. Remember, this took place in 1930, and they had a lot stricter laws back then. They had longer sentences, just like today. People were being locked up for, lots of new federal crimes. You had prohibition going on, and et cetera, et cetera. And anyway, I did a lot of research in the archives, and I was really, there's a lot of serendipity when you're writing a book that, no one has written before. And I heard from someone, found out I was writing this, and they sent me an interview they'd been doing with a survivor of the fire in the 1980s, and they never ended up doing anything with it, and so she sent me a copy of that. And prisoners rarely record, their experiences in prison, so that really helped. Another person that helped was the crime novelist Chester Himes. I don't know if you're familiar with, of him, but he was like, he created these African American detectives that worked in Harlem, and he was in the prison during this. And his early work is based on some of the experiences in the fire. But in any case, until I think about 5 years ago, it was the deadliest fire in any prison in the world until one in Honduras recently, and it killed in less than an hour because of smoke inhalation.
So why do you think that is? But not so much the killing part, but why do you think such a large fire that killed so many is just never talked about? Is it because of something they did wrong?
Well, I think there's they weren't real sympathetic victims to a great extent. I mean, you're talking about rapists and murderers and all that. You're not talking about women working in a sweat factory. You're not talking about, people that, are somewhere, just at their job. You're talking about people that are in there, doing time. So I think, number one, I think most family members, probably don't want to, bring them up and kind of memorialize, their relatives in jail. And so, you don't have a lot of accounts from any family members, and really virtually none from any of the prisoners from that era. And so I think, that's a big part of it. And, I was walking around the city of Columbus, Ohio, sure, there's been a lot of history there, but, since they tore the prison down about 20 years ago, I guess a lot of people don't realize it was downtown. It was one of these big houses. And, no one knew about it. And just like the book I'm working on right now about this double family annihilator. And then my previous book to that was called Convict Cowboys, and it was the first history of the Texas prison rodeo. Nobody had ever written a book on that either. So,
how do you find these stories? How do you find these, actually? Like when you talk about the convict cowboys and this big disaster and the fire, how would you find out about them?
Well, quite often I'm researching another book and I come across stories, and I feel like I know a lot about a lot as far as history of crime and punishment and so forth. And being older, I've heard a lot. And, so it kind of, but when I come across something, and I had never heard of it before, I make a note to maybe look at it later on. And in the case of Fire in the Big House, that I was writing a book, a textbook on crime and criminal justice in America, the history of it, and came across this, and it was, curious, because it did have some ephemeral impact on prisons around the country, making them a little safer, et cetera, et cetera. So I find I come across these things. This book that I'm working on right now on this guy George Hassel, he killed his family of 4 in 1917 in California, buried them under the house. About 9 years later, he's in Texas. Marries his brother's wife after the brother died, and ends up murdering the wife and her 8 kids almost 9 years later. Meanwhile, they haven't found the bodies for the first 4 he killed, and he doesn't admit to it and tell them where to find the bodies until right before his execution in Huntsville. So, a lot of people don't know this story because, it brings up a lot of other subject matter, because I teach courses on serial homicide and mass murder, and there's a little bit of both of these, classifications, in the story of this character. And so, and I wouldn't, the way I heard about 20 years ago, I had a student in one of my murder classes, and he said, well, my great-grandfather was the 5th white person electrocuted in Texas. And, like he was proud of that. I said, congratulations, like he won the Nobel Prize or something. So I said, well, do you have any, family documents or whatever? And he goes, oh, yeah, we've been researching the history for a long time. And he brings me this, big history with some pictures and things like that of it. And I held on to it knowing that this might be something I want to do in the future. And, the past couple of years have been a time where, I finished all my writing projects and I wanted to do something different, and it was a perfect time to take on this project, and the character is bigger than life. I mean, just this guy George Hassel, he would expectorate in the courtroom. He could hit any object that you could believe. He strangled 11 kids with his bare hands, in the two events. And not a shred of remorse, and just an interesting character that I'm learning more and more about as I search Ancestry.com and all these others. And what I found is almost every story about him is wrong. The dates are wrong. Everybody that's written about him has used his confession kind of as their template, and his confession is completely out of whack when you actually look at the background and find out certain dates that he couldn't possibly have done this or that. But he did do these 13 killings, that's for sure, so got to give him credit for that.
Was it easier for someone like that to commit these types of crimes and get away with it back in 1917 as compared to now?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the thing is that, they've been, his common law wife and 3 kids were reported missing by the family in 1917, and the police who went to the house didn't even dig or look under. Today you would have more technology for looking under the ground and stuff, and the only way they found out that the bodies were there is George told somebody, and they drew a map and sent it to the cops in Whittier, California. And so you would have thought the first investigation would have been better, but then I've seen similar investigations in the modern era where people, are being held in the backyard, and the workers come to the house looking for someone being abused, and they're held in the back, and they never find them. So, police work, depends on the training, of the police. But today, you have many less serial killers and things like that, simply for there's less linkage blindness between police forces and so forth.
Yeah. Well, you'd have Nancy Grace out on the scene.
Yeah, shrieking at somebody.
Yeah, that'd be on the news.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's this type of news sells. I mean, once they, the articles about this guy are legion, and he was, kind of, known throughout the world and throughout the United States. And as I was researching these articles, I'm finding, some other stories of other criminals that I had never heard of. In fact, I came across this guy that I'd never heard of before, and he had a restaurant, a bar over in San Antonio, and apparently he had alligators, and he was a Bluebeard, and he would hire a woman, he had an affair with her, and in some cases kill and feed to the alligators. And so I'm thinking this might be my next book. Maybe this will be my Texas Bluebeard series. I don't know.
Go with it.
Yeah.
Do you find that the justice system nowadays and the way it works, and when I bring up Nancy and stuff, do you think that too much is televised, and the action that happens in the courtroom is probably a bad thing, or do you think it's an okay thing, or where do you stand on how it is now?
Well, I love to watch these shows and all of that. It's if it leads type thing. You see a lot of repetition in the stories and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I think in a lot of cases there's an edifying effect on it. Basically, maybe it might open up somebody's eyes to abuse in the family. They might be able to connect the dots through some type of domestic crime or whatever. It's one of those things where it depends on how if you like true crime movies, true crime books. I mean, it's mostly an entertainment factor. A lot of and the TV shows, in fact, really don't. They're great recruiting tools for college. We have a forensic science program, and we have a body farm where I teach. And a lot of people, want to get into the forensic science because they watch CSI and all of that stuff. And I've had students that say to me, "Well, I didn't know you had to be good in science." Because they're watching it on TV. So, well, if you don't like biology, forget about it.
Yeah.
And but it serves its purpose. I don't think most of the shows, are overly scandalous and or romanticize any of the characters. I get kind of tired of seeing the pantheon of serial killers, though. John Wayne Gacy and Ted Bundy, the Hall of Fame of serial killers over and over and over again. But Americans, are very educated about the history of serial killers in America, and that's one of the few things they're educated about as far as history. Because I wish there was many shows about crime fighters, or lawyers, or somebody involved, constructively in the justice system. But people like these case studies of criminals because they are fascinating, especially because half the time you really never understand what their purpose, or motivations were in their crimes.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I was sort of thinking more along the lines of like some of the cases where the whole trial is presented through television and on daily basis because because it really affects, like we've had Kirk Nurmi, and we've had a lot of people that have been in major trials, even Marcia Clark and all that, and they always talk about how stressful it was and how the media would pictures of nude pictures of them or this or that, or they put on weight, they changed their hair, all this stuff, and then a lot of the people watching it kind of are people that hate them, and there's people that love them, and I don't know how you could do your job with that much.
Well, I think it's kind of hard, doing your job, especially if you're the defense quite a bit, let alone the prosecution, because there's a tendency sometimes for people to either identify or fall in love with the perpetrator, They get a big following. And also, too, there's a certain vigilante kind of part of this. You're being tried by the media to a great extent. If you're telegenic, it works to your favor. If you're not, of course, it detracts. And, for the people working on the scene, the Marcia Clarks and the F. Lee Baileys and so forth, and the rest of the, people, and even today, a lot of the ambulance chasers, I think a lot of them use it much like politicians use being a politician to become lobbyists. I think, lawyers use this, sometimes to get their own shows later on because, they get a following as well.
Yeah, yeah.
But there's very few, long-term cases anymore, that I've seen. Outside, when I think of the Jodi Arias case and a few others. So anyway, I know what you're saying though about how you have people that vilify the person, and I don't think people are paying much attention to. I got to tell you, to the lawyers at all. They're listening to the stories and stuff, and the lawyers that can kind of keep their interest are the ones that I think are the ones that are remembered.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Now, in the book Fire in the Big House, I was thinking, so that was an actual fire that happened in the Ohio Penitentiary. Now, that was an overcrowded penitentiary. From what I understand, it had almost double the amount of people it was supposed to have. Actually,
triple.
Oh.
And a lot. They had 4,500, close to 4,500 prisoners, and it was originally meant for around 1,500 or so. And that was the thing with the big house movement of that time period is basically filling them up with prisoners, these large turreted almost castle-like edifices, and it was way overcrowded. And one of the big problems too is looking at the technology of the prisons at that time. The locking technologies, for instance, the cells didn't all open at once. You had to open each one with a key. And there was no training, very little training for officers, and they were very afraid to act on their own simply for the fact that it was a great job to have during the Great Depression, and so they didn't do anything unless they were told to do it. Pretty much the officers.
Wow.
And so they didn't know whether to let the guys out when the smoke started. They were looking for the warden and so forth. I mean, it was just a combination of a lot of errors. And you had people that just gone into prison for lack of not paying child support that day that died. There's a lot of stories like that. People were just on their first day in prison and they died in this, terrible fire.
So how many died in that? Was there 320 or something like that?
320, and then there were two others that died. There was kind of like a riot that took place afterwards, and a machine gun from the National Guard went off by mistake and killed two people who were sleeping in one of the cells. And so, really, indirectly, 322. And then there was others that were transferred to another prison that had another fire that killed some of them. And so, it depends what you add, but 320 died from smoke inhalation, basically.
So when you have something like that, now, did they ever figure out why the fire started?
Well, that was, there's all kinds of reports at the time, all kinds of investigations, and initially they thought it was some type of electrical short or some electrical fire, but as it turns out, after a sequence of events, it turns out it was an arson that went wrong. Four of the prisoners were, tied into this. And apparently they had lit the fire. It was supposed to go off while everybody was in the dining hall, but because of the winds and all that, it didn't go off until everybody was back locked in their cells. And so of the four that were kind of tied into this, two ended up taking their own lives, hanging themselves in the prisons. So it took a while for them to figure out it was arson. They had it wasn't until they found a kite being passed between two of these prisoners, and it was brought to their attention.
Wow. That's just crazy. And now, so I guess they had no regulations, or very few regulations, because you mentioned how it was not only overcrowded, but it wasn't very sanitary, and they didn't have adequate food and things like that. So they didn't have the regulation that they do now, or?
Well, they even had gas lighters for their cigarettes. There was a form of gas that they used that was definitely it was not fireproof, and they would often make their own fires in their cells to smoke out bugs out of their mattresses and things like that. So when people smelled the smoke, they didn't pay much attention, and it wasn't until they saw the smoke.
Did they get in trouble for having the overcrowding and the dirty conditions and the bad food?
No, most people didn't care. Most people were on the cusp of the Great Depression, and even today, people think they deserve what they get if they end up in prison. I mean, I'm in Texas; it's 95 degrees today, and some of the prisons don't have air conditioning. So even today in the 21st century. And in the winters, sometimes the toilets freeze, so you get ice, because there's no heat. And there's very few people that really care about those things. Wow. It's kind of like my book on convict cowboys. It starts in 1931 when they introduced this rodeo. And back then, they didn't think it would be a moneymaker or anything, but it turned out that people were willing to pay to watch, them try and, these death-defying feats that even a rodeo guy wouldn't do in a arena. And so the money that was made from this was used to buy them dentures and, artificial arms and legs and things like that. So it was for their recreation and also for their medical upkeep, because Austin wasn't giving any money to the criminal justice system in the 1930s.
Now, how do you think the prisons will fare in something like the COVID-19 that's going on?
Oh, it's good. Those are absolute incubators. I mean, you already have, antibiotic-resistant tuberculosis and other things in that, and it's just, a disaster waiting to happen. And you have a lot of geriatric patients also that, they have like separate units with a lot of the older patients that have a lot of medical problems. And, who knows how many of them have contracted it or how many have died. I don't trust any of the record keeping at this point, because nobody really knows anything still about anything. They're just guessing. It's just, I think, a disaster, waiting to happen as far as, deaths of prisoners, because the prisons are crowded. America has like 5% of the world's population, and probably 25% of the world's prisoners. So yet crime has been going down for years, and so how do you explain it? It's I guess it's maybe a conundrum or a paradox. America has a love affair with prisons. Simply it.
Now, when you say that, do you think it's that they love putting people away, or do you think it's because it's like a business, and when you run it like a business, they look for numbers?
Well, in certain communities, I think the business aspect is really important. If you notice, they usually build prisons out in rural areas, and it supplies jobs to a lot of people in the area, and unfortunately, it creates big problems. Most of the people that are in prison are from the inner city somewhere, and most of the people that are out in the urban rural areas, are farmers and, people that have really never met people like these prisoners before, which isn't great. But I don't think there's any community that would refuse to have a prison built in their backyard. And they're constantly crunching numbers. I mean, that was the thing is, prisons, when they were first created, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, they had to be self-sufficient in every respect. And the prison designs that were best at producing lots of goods very cheaply were the designs that survived, and the ones that didn't, of course, fell by the wayside. So money has always been and profit has always been a big part. Today, though, I wouldn't say it's profit as much as, just paying the bills. Just having them, for instance, raise crops that they can use, for food, raising livestock that can be used for food in a lot of prisons. So it's a zero-sum game, that's for sure. You have just trying to maximize the profits. The problem with doing that is, you can't have prison-made goods competing with free world goods. So you have a limited, audience to sell, your goods to.
So now you being professor in criminal justice and criminology, if you could change anything about the system instantly, the whole justice system or the court system, the prisons, you've done a lot of work in the prisons for writing, what would you change about them?
Well, I would obviously have a lot more alternatives to prison, especially for nonviolent offenders. I mean, you have really a small group of violent offenders that commit a large part of the violent crimes, and I think that they should be locked up and at least trained. I would introduce some education in the prisons. I mean, a lot of the prisons used to offer courses where you get high school education, college degree, including the Texas prison system, but they don't do that anymore. They don't have these Pell Grants and that sort of thing. So, preparing them to get out. And also too, putting, like, a lot of them are, have been doing drugs or alcohol, when they committed their crimes, and, put a lot more effort towards that side of, that side of the picture, like they do in Europe. Europe's one of the few continents probably where they don't have an overcrowded prison system, although, you have some problems in some places, but they rely on alternatives, to, putting, people in jail. So, it's been messed up for so long. You have to get the interest of, the population. And one of the critiques of the Obama era was that he didn't start working on criminal justice reform until the end of his, his terms. And, I think that, that's very important as much as, fixing the infrastructure of the country and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
How easy do you think it'll be to convince Americans that there are alternatives to prisons? Because I think that's a pretty tough road to hoe,
Yeah, well, I think as the younger generations who are less, kind of tied to any specific, punitive environment, I think, they're the ones that are going to be making the changes. Just like we're seeing the changes, with gay marriage and all of that, and marijuana use, and just having an open mind to making it a better world. So I have a lot of hope for the next generation taking over from all the old white men basically that are just keeping everything as it is and really not changing anything, just giving lip service because it's so easy. Because as it is, older people really are, unless they're well educated, are usually not in favor of any type of real big prison reform, and also too uneducated young people. They just have to understand the racial disparity that's in prisons and the death penalty. And right now, the decline of the death penalty is the best sign, at least in Texas, the best sign that I've seen. That now you have a majority of people that if they had the choice between executing someone or keeping them in jail for life, they would go for the jail and life. And I think, looking at trials and things like that, people are much more educated about the mistakes that can be made for, people being innocent and being executed. So I think, those types of shows that we were talking about before, I think that's a very important role that they play. So people are much more knowledgeable about, DNA and bad witness identification and things like that.
So when you actually write one of these books, and you've been writing, do you hope, like, what is it that you want people to get out of your book? Like, if I finish reading one of your books, like The Fire in the Big House, what do you want me to walk away with? Well,
first of all, I'd like you to walk away saying, I never knew that before. That was, and really kind of, you learn something. So I want it to be a learning experience, obviously. And I want, and I write, I use an interdisciplinary, type of research. I tie in a lot of different things. And, I'd like to appeal to a wide range of people. And then I like to end it on a note where, you can get some type of parallels with today. So that, it's just not stuck in the 1930. So, I like to follow it up to the present and try and, add that to the lesson. What we're doing today as what we were doing in 1930. Have we learned anything since then? That's, so, I'd like it to be, and I'd like it, of course, to be entertaining as well.
So where do you see yourself going now? Like, what if you plan on to keep writing books? I know you're doing the one on George Hassel, but are you going to keep on doing this sort of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I have probably my biggest book coming out in October, and it's called Power on the Inside, a global history of prison gangs, and it's the first history of prison gangs around the world. No one's ever done that before. So I examined, prison gangs in, Australia and New Zealand, in Singapore, Thailand, Native American prison gangs in America. I mean, it's very, very wide-ranging with a lot of historical research. And so that was a big undertaking. And, Antarctica is probably the only continent that doesn't have prison gangs, that I know of. I mean, the penguins look like, kind of shady characters. But anyway, this book, I worked on for, kind of a couple of years along with another book, and it's got 80 pictures showing different prison gang members. It gets into, the whole, while it can be used by researchers and academics, it also has a lot of really interesting stories where the impact of colonialism, for instance, on prison populations, places like, Australia and New Zealand with the indigenous people, that are locked up. I mean, who would have thought there's more people in gangs in New Zealand than in the Army? I mean, a lot of this, people, have no clue about. And so anyway, I enjoy, doing this, but I'm thinking about, because I've done 2 books. I did a book called An Eye for an Eye, A Global History of Crime and Punishment. It's mostly from a non-Western perspective. And I'm happy to say it's been translated into Chinese and Croatian and Turkish and published in other parts of the world. But I'm not, don't want to take these big projects. Just working on one murder case to me is great. So I think I'm just going to write, research murder cases that have, kind of, some relevance.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, I'm just wondering, when you write about the prisons, the gangs in the prisons, do people just take on the same habits that they do in the outside world? Like, we have gangs in a lot of the major cities. Is it the same?
That's a very good question. Basically, most of the prison gangs were imported from the outside, but they're, bringing in, their gang allegiances and so forth. But there are prison gangs that were created, in the inside originally, and over time have kind of morphed as younger prisoners have got into it. And just looking at the prison gangs are very important to the running of prisons all around the world. They call it informal governance. So basically, law enforcement, I should say, correctional officers and their administrators have found it, like in Latin America and parts of Africa, and it would never be admitted in the United States, but they let the prison gangs have a lot more autonomy than you would think, and the prison gangs have a reason for not wanting to get no gang war, because what's important for them is protecting their revenue streams in prison, and you can't do that when everybody's killing each other. So you need to have some freedom. So Latin America, of course, has a huge prison overcrowding problem. Has tons of prison gangs that kind of self-govern.
So and like also too.
Yeah. It really is. I mean, they create and they don't just, get involved in that. In Latin America, for instance, some of them, they provide health care and education. I mean, they might be teaching someone how to pick a lock. It's some type of education, Wow. And so they take on all of this. And in Asia, in places like Thailand and Singapore, and even Bali in Indonesia, they all have prison gangs, and they all have, their own different, social networks, and they provide, kind of some type of balance within the prison system.
Now, that's interesting. Now, so when we watch series on TV or shows or miniseries and Netflix, when we talk about prisons, what comes to mind to me is HBO had that Oz series.
Right.
Do you find that to be fairly realistic, or is that just totally off base?
Yeah, I saw a lot of episodes of it. I won't say I saw the whole series, but I think it had a lot of reality. Basically showing, the people that call the shots, for instance, the power that they hold. I mean, you have these racist gangs in prisons, for instance, where they might kill on sight, but yet they might sell drugs to each other. I mean, prison gangs are very pragmatic. So they might have a philosophy that they subscribe to, but they don't necessarily hold to it if there's something that they can benefit from. And, it's one of the things I came across is looking at people that, these hybrid prison gangs, or looking at people that are mixed heritage. What prison gang do they join when they go in? For instance, if you're an Orthodox Jew and and you're in prison, and you need to join a gang, or kind of, so usually they end up with some type of white gang. Asians usually go with Hispanic gangs. It depends on, what part of the United States or whatever. And I was surprised to find the Native American gangs, a number of them in places like Minnesota and Arizona, Washington State, and that sort of thing. And these are, for the most part, were imported from the streets. A lot of the gangs were imported from, urban areas like Minneapolis and Phoenix and those types of places.
So in a way, they get put in prison, and they kind of go to each other because they're familiar with their own behaviors, right? Like as a gang. Well,
more so for protection, and also too, if you're with a particular gang, you're basically protected, from sexual attacks and that sort of thing, or being extorted. But a lot of the gangs, violate their own rules. For instance, in South Africa, there's something called the number gangs, and they were threatening the Blade Runner. Remember Oscar Pistorius?
Right.
The runner. Yeah, when he went to prison, they told him, they had to put him in administrative segregation because they were going to go after him because they thought he was too big for his britches. And, they have these long traditions, and if you listen to their creation sagas and their myths and that sort of thing, if you trace them back, there's usually, kind of a kernel of truth in that. But, they make everybody, learn, a particular history of the gang. They enforce discipline within the gang. Like you can't go and just punch another inmate in most cases. But what's changing is the newer generations of prisoners going in. They're less willing to, follow the old rules. They used to have something called the convict code, where you don't snitch, you don't do this, you don't do that, you don't steal from another inmate. So the younger prisoners coming in, and also, too, a lot of the older prison gangs, they had blood in, blood out. You had to, take blood to get in the gang, and the only way you got out is in the coffin, basically. Mm-hmm. And the newer people going in, they say, no, I'm not doing that. And so you have gangs like Tango Blast, in Texas, has over 100,000 members. And, basically they, if they want to hit somebody, they hit somebody. They join Tango Blast and they go back to their original gangs when they're on the streets. But if you join a gang in prison, in most cases, you have to go back to that gang on the streets. There's no, separation. but we're seeing a lot of these rules changing, as, a different, mentality is entering the prison system.
Wow, it's interesting. Now, do you have a website or a place that people can go to find out about you or your books and all that in one place?
No, I've been too lazy to do that, to be honest. I have my, my email and Facebook, I can be contacted on, and, I don't mind that at all. And Amazon has most of my books, and so they usually have, some reviews or information on those. But I probably should do that. I complained that no one buys the books, so I maybe sell more books that way.
Yeah.
I noticed there's a lot of entrepreneurial people doing crime-related topics, and I'm not very entrepreneurial. Although I did Convict Cowboys was optioned for a TV series or a movie, so anyway, we'll see how that goes.
Just takes one. Anyway, so we'll have you linked up to our site as well, so people listening can do one click and check out your books.
Yeah.
Our guest has been Mitchel P. Roth, and we've been talking about a lot of his books, recommend them a lot. And Fire in the Big House is the one that kind of I touched on to. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us.
Well, thanks for reaching out. I was very happy to be here.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
Show is over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.